Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the SportsPro podcast. I am currently sat in a... Oh, actually, we do have windows in this room. That's rare. I'm currently sat in a windowed room in the McCaskill, the host of the SportsPro Madrid conference, which we've now been running for more years than I care to remember. Alongside me is my colleague Steve McCaskill, who has been... Well, I charged him as being my eyes and ears on the ground here at SportsPro Madrid as I'm running around doing a million different things. Steve's a much more studious note taker than I am, so I'm really relying on his insights into what he's heard here, because we've had some really fascinating sessions. I think the best place to start is probably right at the start, the kick-off keynote, shall we say, with Laurent-Eric Lelay, who is, of course, the big boss at France Télévisions. I hope you enjoyed my French pronunciation, Steve.
It was perfect.
As a man of Europe, how did you enjoy Laurent's session?
I'm just going to start off by saying, to your first point, this job is wonderful in that we get to travel to lots of nice places, see some, meet some wonderful people, but we do spend an inordinate amount of time in windowless rooms, I guess slaving away to make the content that
never sleeps.
Content never sleeps, and I'm not sure we do in these events, but yes, even for a man who is, I guess, as intolerant of the sun as I am, I would like some vitamin D from time to time. So just gonna tick that box off first. But yes, the first session was with Laurent-Eric Lelay, who was here last year as well, talking about French broadcasting more in general. But this year he was talking his reflections of Paris 2024, which we've discussed many times on the pod. It's definitely on SportsPro. What a success that was for everyone, and not least France Télévisions. I'm going to say France Télévisions many times because it's a very satisfying thing to say. As an English speaker, to get something right in the French language. But he said it himself, I'm not going to talk about Paris 2024 in terms of what you already know, because it's been well documented. I'm going to talk about what it meant for us. And he basically gave us an overview of the story of how France Télévisions approached the Olympics, how they decided to cover it before they knew they had the rights to it, because they knew it was going to be an event of national importance, and they put a lot of resource behind it. I think his exact words were, we didn't just get the sport department involved, we mobilized the whole broadcaster behind this. In the build up to the games, they created a daily show in prime time about the Olympics in the build up to it. They broadcast the torch arriving in France live, which he said he doesn't think's been done before. He wasn't able to back up that claim, but he said he's pretty certain. And then, of course, the Olympics themselves, where they devoted... So France Télévisions has two main terrestrial channels and some digital services, but their two main channels were just Olympics, and then they had a pop-up channel as well. So a lot of this sounds like what we've discussed before, but I think it was really interesting to get that insight from the host broadcaster. The opening ceremony was the most watched event in French television history. He also talked about... his words, not mine, about how the French can be a bit pessimistic and lead up to things. And I think that's something we saw in the build-up to London 2012. I don't know if you were in London at the time, Tom, but it was very much doom and gloom, wasn't it? And then we had the best 2 weeks of our lives.
Yeah, I'd say that's the peak of civilization. In fact, me and my friends regularly discuss London 2012 as the peak of civilization. But it definitely didn't feel like it was going to be... it definitely didn't feel like it was going to have that kind of outcome before, especially having lived there in the build-up and seen the building works going on. And yeah, as you say, there is definitely, I think with any host nation, it's almost like you talk yourself into it being worse, because then if it is bad, you're well prepared, and then if it's great, you're surprised. And it sounds like in this case, it's the latter.
I think the Olympics, it's such a shock to the system for any host city. It's not normal to have the eyes of the world on you and have that event for just 2 weeks. It's, scale up to that extent. And my defining memory of London 2012 was I went to go see Gabon versus South Korea in the football. It was 0-0. It was the worst game of football I've ever seen in my life at Wembley. But Britain won I think it was their second goal, Bradley Wiggins, in the time trial, and the whole Wembley way just cheering about cycling. But I do digress. But he was very much like, the French are very naturally pessimistic, and there was that sense of pessimism around the Olympics, despite their best efforts with the build-up. And of course, he said everything went well. He said even the wet. We all remember the opening ceremony and the deluge of rain, and which I think added to the spectacle. Personally, I don't know what you thought about that, Tom.
I'd admit I wasn't a big fan of the opening ceremony. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. But then opening ceremonies rarely do. I think they usually make a lot of sense to the people in the host countries and never much sense to the ones outside. I don't think if you'd asked someone in 2012, for example, like, what on earth is going on here? Why are we looking at the Industrial Revolution? Or what they wouldn't have known that was the Industrial Revolution that was being shown. They'd just been, what is this absolutely bizarre production? The only one that I can really think of as being kind of quite captivating and maybe translating outside of that is Beijing with all the drummers. But I think that they were just showing off.
I mean, Beijing was a different level. I mean, I would disagree with you on Paris. I think it was more of a television spectacle than it was a in-person spectacle, just by the very nature of it on the River Seine. And Laurent Eric, he said basically that everything went well, but they saw the weather cloud and they feared the worst. But they were very happy that it turned out. And of course, once the Olympic flame was lit, Celine Dion performed. Did
you just franglicize Celine Dion?
I may have done. I think it's because I'm getting too caught up in France Télévisions, which again I will say again. I think Celine Dion, who also Eurovision legend in Switzerland, so I should really get that one right. But once she performed, the rain stopped basically, and he said just everything went well, and they were talking about he gave perspective from a public service broadcaster. He said, just because you're a PSB doesn't mean you shouldn't chase ratings, but it does help. You can do things that commercial broadcaster can't do, particularly when it came to the Paralympics, in terms of that freedom that they had to broadcast. And he just gave the outline of how a public service broadcaster should handle these major events, blanket coverage, do everything they can in terms of the reach. And it was very insightful to hear. It's almost like there is a defining Olympics every 12 years. So you had London 2012, you had Paris 2024, you had Sydney in 2000 as these benchmark moments for the Games. And I think there was definitely that different vibe about this year, and in terms of what the learnings are for the sports industry and particularly broadcasters, and what's going to happen with LA 2028. I was at Sportel a couple of weeks ago, and I heard for some Olympic broadcasters about what they're planning for those games, which is it's 3.5 years away. So a lot of learnings there for the sports industry, a lot of learnings for broadcasters in terms of how they should cover these events. And to be quite honest, I think we are both a fan of free-to-air TV. We're both a fan of public service broadcasting. So I think it was very good just to hear that sense of optimism to counteract the pessimism that he spoke of at the beginning.
Maybe we could, if we hear a clip of that part of the session now.
We are lucky we get the rights. We have exclusive free rights, and but from that point, we bear the immense responsibility to broadcast the games to the French audience. The ambition is very, very important. It's why we decide to do something unprecedented on an editorial point of view, and our president decided to mobilize not only the sport department, but the entire organization of France Télévisions. So of course the idea was to start our programming well in advance, telling the story of the preparation and gradually building up interest and enthusiasm among the French public for the event. Mm-hmm. Because we have to remember that 5 years ago, we had, and the Olympic Committee, a lot of question mark about the success. They had to sell a lot of tickets. So it was very, very important to be close to them in order to help them to build the event. Mm-hmm. We did it gradually, but we accelerate just 1 year before the game. And we made a big decision because we created a 26 minutes daily, but only during the week, show, broadcasted on prime time, dedicated to the games. And it was an ambitious decision because it's not very easy to make big ratings 1 year before the games, but we made this decision in order, to tell the story. And I think this is the advantage of a public service, is that we can sometimes make some decision even if you are not sure to have good ratings.
That was France Télévisions. What else have you been sitting in on, Steve?
A great panel with UEFA, the IOC, and TikTok, talking about social media strategy and how to reach the fans. And again, they talked about the Olympics again. I think this is probably the event where we're going to round up the Paris 2024 chat. I think moving forward, it's now something that we've covered a lot. These are the final learnings from that event, and before we throw it forward. But they were talking about social strategy, how TikTok helped amplify the coverage in terms of bringing it to a new audience, how to IOC in particular talked about how the entire point of it is to drive people to the broadcasters and maximize the value of their TV rights. Jérôme Parmentier, as the head of media rights at the IOC, described social media as their frenemies. Or rather, he said he used to regard them as frenemies. TikTok were on stage, and I think they've got a very good partnership with TikTok, so I don't think he was being entirely serious on that front. But when you work with social media, you have not necessarily competing aims, but you have different metrics of success. So, for example, something like TikTok, it's about engagement. It's about getting people to create content. And then they've got, rev sharing, advertising. For the IOC, they don't see that necessarily unless it's part of the rev sharing agreement. For them, they just want people to see something on TikTok and then go to the BBC, go to France Télévisions, go to NBC. That's what they want from that. And it was just interesting to hear them, I guess, talking quite plain terms about the relationship. I think we hear a lot of chat about these partnerships, and there's a lot of buzzwords, a lot of industry jargon. But it's basically, they were very direct, very open about it, and so with TikTok. I thought TikTok made their case very well as how they work with sport and talk about things like Snoop Dogg, etc., which again is something that we've covered extensively. And then Guy Laurent Epstein from UEFA, who I know you spoke to, Tom, as well.
Yeah, if anyone wants to listen to that interview, you can. It's on this podcast feed. It went out last Thursday. Very well worth checking out. I got quite a long chat with him on a load of different subjects. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're enjoying it, listen to last week's podcast, and hopefully you'll enjoy that too. What did Guy Laurent have to say?
He's definitely someone worth listening to. I just have to echo that, and that's one of the good things about SportsPro events. You get those people in the room and you can get those insights. He was talking more about social media at Euro 2024 and how UEFA were using it, and also as part of a wider, I think he's called it, again, buzzword bingo, but a 360-degree digital offering for the Euros. And for me, you look at the NBA, you look at the NFL, they have a lot of centralized rights. They're able to reserve those through applications. With UEFA, obviously, it's a bit more fragmented. So he talked about how they use that content, how they, have those reserved rights, and they make the most of it. And he also said how they do have a conflict. He mentioned again this conflicting relation with social media, and the exact thing he said was, "We love them, but their success is not our success."
I think that's a really interesting point, and it applies not just to broadcasters and rights holders, but almost anyone, or especially us as a media business, for example. Right, SportsPro's relationship with social media has changed massively. It was once viewed as a really key tool for driving traffic towards your own platforms, your own websites, etc. And now it's not really the case. Like, the social media platforms almost clocked on to the fact that this is what people were coming on to do. They were coming on to whichever one it was in order to go somewhere else. And now it's all about keeping people on their platforms, because that's where they get their value from. I think anyone who is working in social media has realised that that's what it's about. It's never going to be a product that drives someone to somewhere else. As Guy Laurent said, it's their success is not our success. It's very much their success, and you have to try and make the best of what you can with it. And if that is engagement, reach, likes, clicks, shares, okay, fine. But you need to have a goal for what that is in terms of, strategically, is this just about your brand, or is this about something else?
Yeah, I think that if you look at Twitter/X, in the early days, that was a source of of referrals. It was like, you promoted your content. Social media has definitely shifted away from that, and sports organizations, they've got smarter about how they use it. People aren't going to click on a link to a match report anymore, and also the algorithms don't favor that. And one thing that Guy Laurent said was that in the early days of social media, it was basically repurposing broadcast, in terms of they put, and still do that, but they do adapt it. There's some really clever AI tools that make sure that the ball is always in shot for vertical video, etc. But they are actively working with influencers and putting iPhones in the crowd so people can get the crowd reaction. We've all seen those limbs videos, and a lot of them are from fans, but they're working to improve the quality of those. I mean for me, I don't know about you, but I'm never going to record a celebration in the crowd. Like, I'm too caught up in the moment. I do think it's a weird thing, but if you have the rights holder saying we'll do that, we'll get high quality videos of the crowd celebrating. I know it's them controlling the narrative, but it's also showing the emotion. It's also creating that bespoke content to keep people on the platform and just using social in a different way. So I think it was just really insightful, and again, that session was very important for anyone who works in the industry, just to hear about how two of the biggest players are using these platforms.
I also believe that you spoke to Anna Thompson from the BBC. Can you just tee up your conversation with that a little bit, and then maybe at the end we'll come back and do our reflections with a couple of beers in our hand at the end of the event?
Yeah, so Anna Thompson, who is one of the heads of women's sport at BBC, she was on a panel talking about the commercial future of women's sport, and I spoke to her about, more specifically about her remit and the role of women's sport at the BBC, and also the BBC's commitment to women's sport. And I think the key reflection from the panel, and also something that I think came across in the conversation, was we don't want to have these panels anymore. We don't have these conversations in the future. We just want women's sport to be sport, and it to be, and it is getting there, but there's still, I think people in the industry are getting tired of making the commercial case for women's sport when it's so apparent. But Anna was, she's behind a lot of the BBC's amazing coverage. We talked about the new WSL deal in the UK and what that means for for the BBC in terms of how it fits in. We talked about the 100 cricket. We looked forward to the Women's Rugby World Cup and the Women's Euro 2025 next year. And then we talked about, I guess, broader industry issues. So how do we promote talent in, female talent in the industry, in terms of how does the industry make sure that talent can be nurtured and how there's, opportunities. It also talks about how covering women's sport is different to men's sport in terms of not just formats but also content. Like, how do you lean into lifestyle, the celebrity focus of it? How do you make it as appealing as possible? And I think just the one thing I wanted to round up on that was, with exceptions like netball, most people who watch women's sport are men. So how do you broaden the women audience for women's sport? So a very wide-ranging conversation, and definitely urge people to check that out.
Yeah, let's kick over to that interview now.
Hi, I'm Steve McCaskill. I'm technology editor at SportsPro, and I'm at SportsPro Madrid, and I'm joined by Anna Thompson, who is the head of women's sport at BBC Sport. Anna, thank you very much for joining me. Maybe it's good to start off by explaining, what the role of women's sport at BBC Sport is and what BBC's commitment to women's sport is. So, both sides of that relationship, how does it fit in with the overall organisation and its output?
Yeah, so actually there are two women's sport leads, as we call them at BBC Sport. So there's myself and Victoria Cotton, but she's not here today. That's how important we find women's sport, but also we support women working in sport. So it's both the content and also the women who work in sport as well. Women's sport, it's really important to the BBC. I've sort of had this role really since London 2012, that huge summer when obviously we hosted the Olympics in Great Britain. And it was off the back of that where Barbara Slater, who was our former director of sport, she really wanted to then amplify women's sport across the piece. So really I've been involved in that, and it has grown massively in that time, but there's still obviously a lot of work to do. We're really passionate about trying to keep hold of rights where we can, but obviously that is challenging when you have budgets, and it's great that women's sport is growing so massively, but then that also means that you might get priced out of rights, for example. So, we put a lot of emphasis on our women's sport portfolio, and we've got lots of great events coming up, in 2025. So really proud of that and really proud of the work we do. But it's not just about what people can watch or listen to. It's more around that whole ecosystem of what can we do for the BBC Sport website, for iPlayer, and obviously off our platforms as well. And that includes social media and what can we do in that space as well.
Yeah, we've had Barbara Slater at a couple of our events, and she said many things that you've just said. It's interesting that London 2012 was the spark, because at least from an outsider point of view, that really felt a bit of a milestone in terms of how women's sport was interpreted or viewed in the UK, given the makeup of Britain's medal tables, Jess Ennis-Hill being the face of those games. So was it London 2012 that sparked the creation of that role, or was it something that was just a natural continuation of the growth of women's sport in Britain?
Yeah, so that role was created, and actually the first women's sport lead was Shelley Alexander, but she's now retired. So, and I was her sort of deputy, and then obviously I've taken it on with Vicky Cotton since then. So, it was after those. But just to say that BBC, we have supported women's sport a lot earlier than that. We showed the Women's Euros in 2005, for example. So we have always supported women's sport where we can. But that just seemed that step change where the amount of people who are watching the Olympics and then obviously the Paralympics on Channel 4 as well, that it was such a game changer. We do use that term, but it's like, what can we actually then do across the piece on the BBC to really make sure that we're making the most and maximising women's sports?
Yeah, we'll move on to specific properties in a bit, but I think, how do you cover women's sport differently? I mean, in many cases, how do you cover it the same as men's sport? But how do you cover it differently in terms of creative output, or both in terms of content and formats? Are there things that you have to do differently because that's where the audience is, or just because the property lends itself better to that?
Yeah, that's right. So we know, for example, that watching women's sport, more men do watch women's sport than women. That is changing. I would say things like netball and gymnastics are still actually better, more women watch than men, but things like football, cricket, rugby, the bigger sports, it is still predominantly male who are watching it. So it's like, how can we get more women watching women's sport? But then it's also recognising that, what do younger women want? Because that's a big audience for us. So we know the kind of, we've done a lot of research into the kind of content that people are interested in. So they tell us, they want to know the backstories of the athletes, they want to know their lifestyles, what they're currently doing. With the younger audience, they also are quite interested in that celebrity fan factor as well. So it's about what kind of content can we create for these bespoke areas, really. We also do obviously a lot of work on social media. I mean, I say in the women's space, it's primarily TikTok and Instagram. They seem to be really supportive of women's sport, and it does seem to be that safer space. We get less issues when we promote women's sport on those platforms compared to other social media platforms. So it is, again, just making sure that you're creating the content that they want. The challenge for us is, it's great we do that, but we then want them to come back to the BBC to look at other BBC content that we've created as well. So there's always that challenge about if you go off platform, how do you get them back?
In terms of athlete content as well, and again, it's something we've heard a lot about. Athletes, particularly in women's sport, they're very keen to get involved because they understand the role they can play in promoting the sport, and also they just want to do it. Why wouldn't you want to shout about what you're doing? So how do you lean into that side of content, athlete-driven content?
Yeah, I mean, that's very important to us because, as I say, people are really interested in the athletes themselves. And in turn, we feel that if you get to know an athlete and you invest in them, then you're more likely to want to watch or listen, if they're running or if they're competing in a certain event or in a certain match. So to us, it's just a whole part of the package, really. It's a bit of a no-brainer. I mean, what I would say, actually, I think women or sports women still feel that, they've got to use their platform for change and for better. So, we saw when England women won the Euros in 2022, they were obviously celebrating, but at the same time they thought, no, this is our time, this is our platform. What can we do there? So obviously we had that impassioned speech by Leah Williamson, in which she said when they just won the Euros, and also the next day they then sent a letter to Downing Street asking for more football provision in schools. So, I think it is still really important. I think from a society perspective, they are prepared to put their head above the parapet and just speak out when they're not happy about things. It was interesting, even the other day when Sam Kerr and Christy Mewis announced that they were having a baby, the amount of backlash on certain social media platforms because they're the same-sex couple. But then you saw the people then responding to that and really trying to be positive, because these are just two women who are having a child together, and that happens a lot. So it's just bringing society together as one, really. So I'm really proud that they do. I think sometimes I wish they didn't have to do that, but they do, and I'm really proud that they do it.
I was going to say, I don't want to trivialise any of the points you made, but as you say, you wish they didn't have to do it and just enjoy things. So for the Euros, one of my favourite videos of, to be honest, any sport that year was them gate crashing Serena Wiegmann's press conference. It's with 3 lions, and so it's I still. But
it's things like that, and that was completely natural. Obviously, not even the press officer. He looked a bit startled, the FA press officer. So they weren't expecting that, but that was just that moment of joy. But actually, that can have massive effects. And actually, one other thing I was going to say as well, Chloe Kelly whipping off her top, and actually we've done a piece on the BBC Sport website. It's 25 years ago since Brandi Chastain did it, but in the USA in the 1999 World Cup. So it was we've done a whole history piece about that. But that was such an iconic image so many years ago. Then straight away when Chloe Kelly did it, I automatically knew. But then there'll be a lot of people that won't even have remembered the 1999 World Cup, let alone been a fan of it. So I think it's just trying to connect some of those things that happen as well. So yeah, but I think things that are natural and feel natural, they just resonate so much better than something feeling that it's forced or it's not natural.
Yeah, it's also about, I do remember that moment because I think it was the first time I'd ever really interacted with women's football, because it was front page news and I was on holiday, and I think it must have been one of the American newspapers that had that image, and it was, again, just iconic image that you can recall back to and create content like that. One of the things about that, you compare Euro 2005 to Euro 2022, and Euro 2022 was it's a huge TV event, huge audiences, and the BBC played a big role in generating those by promoting it and having it on its main channel. When it comes to scheduling things, what those conversations about what channel to put it on in terms of both linear channel and then also what goes on iPlayer, what goes on Red Button. If you're negotiating deals and there's iPlayer specific components to it, how do you solve that equation? Who's involved in all that process?
There's obviously, it's not me. I mean, I can give my opinion, but it's not me. We obviously have people, we have channel controllers, we have rights teams, etc. So, I mean, everybody still wants to be on BBC One or BBC Two because they are still watch, most people watch television on those, but we know that audience and how they consume TV is changing. So obviously iPlayer is very important as well. So, for us, there will be, if a match is going to go or an event's going to go on BBC One, then we have things like time slot averages. And so really it's going to have to beat that to be able to go on that. But we also recognise if something's a big event, we want to put it on your best channels. So obviously next year, we do have the Women's Euros, which is sharing with ITV, but all the matches that BBC have got, which will be 16 of them, we will be showing those, across BBC One, BBC Two and iPlayer as well. And then we've also got the Women's Rugby World Cup as well, which is a massive event for us as well next year. So, as much you want those on the main channels, but we understand sometimes there are scheduling clashes, like if there is a huge historic audience for a certain type of content, it might be Gardener's World on a Friday night, which we're trying to put a WSL match on a Friday night. Sometimes we clash with things like that. So it's just being aware of that. But for me, the biggest piece is just that visibility and discoverability, because if people don't know you're showing it, why would they tune in to watch? I'd just say on the WSL, the challenge there is where do you put it? And, obviously both BBC and Sky, who share the WSL, we sort of identified that Sunday 12:30 slot is a really good slot, both of us. So whoever normally gets the first pick, we alternate who gets the picks. We tend to go for that slot, but then the person who's got the second pick, where do they then put that match, which then isn't clashing with a lot of men's sport? Because, if you do clash with men's sport and bigger men's sport, then you just know your figures won't be as good.
There's one obvious time slot that some have suggested could open up. Would that be of interest to you?
I think the issue for me, and this is just my personal opinion, I think there's still a lot of men who follow men's football. So if you're talking about the 3 o'clock slot,
yes.
Yeah, I'm talking about the 3 o'clock slot. I just sort of think that you might have some kind of audience, and it just depends what kind of audience you're looking for. But I still feel like a lot of men and women still do follow matches. Now, I know there's not as many Premier League matches at that time because they're split, but there's still a heck of a lot of football fan base, looking at the Championship, at Leagues 1, Leagues 2, obviously Scottish matches as well. So I just think it's probably dangerous to put it in there. For example, like BBC, we do Final Score. That does incredibly well for us. Where would that then go? So it's not as simple as just saying, let's put it when it's that blackout. I don't think it's as simple as that, but maybe at some point they might trial it and just see what happens. But it's knowing what is the audience that you're trying to get in that slot.
No, very fair points. Another area of your role, again, how do you always promote female on-screen talent in terms of giving opportunities, developing their talent, ensuring that they have, I guess, the framework to succeed? And obviously I've seen recently the new reporter initiative by a new director of sport. How does that all play into your role? What do you do on that side?
Yeah, obviously it's really important. And for me, obviously I want to make sure we're bringing in a lot of different voices. I don't think women's football should just be women presenters and women commentators and women and pundits. I think, there can be that mix, but then I also want that mix in men's football as well. The more sports that have that more tradition of where it has been more equal, things like tennis, for example, and athletics, nobody seems to mind who's commentating or who's giving analysis on men's or women's events in those sports. So I think we've got to get to that stage with particularly football. But yeah, we run a lot of schemes. We're always looking out for those who may be finishing in the game as well, who are interested in punditry. But it's about protecting them as well, because I know that, obviously, again, social media can either be a really good thing or sometimes a really negative thing. So it's just making sure you're protecting people, but it's great seeing how people have developed. So, going back to, if we talk about Alex Scott, I first got involved with Alex when she was still playing for Arsenal, and it's when we used to do we still do the women's football show, but when it first started, when the WSL started up, the highlights programme there, but she was really engaged around media and how it works. And actually, you know, she then went and studied it, and she's got a qualification in broadcasting. So, you know, that was my first with Alex, and it's great to see how she's developed. So I think sometimes it's quite hard when you throw people in. You can't just expect them to go on network television and be completely polished, but it's about giving them plenty of feedback as well, and honest feedback. There's no point just saying, oh yeah, that was fine. You've got to say what they did right and what they did wrong and what they need to do for the next time. Ideally, you want to try and trial them out on some games which probably aren't on network, but that's not always the case. But, you know, I just think there's obviously lots of sports out there now that you know, you can really train and hone your skill really.
One trend that I've seen is social media and I guess influence-led coverage, because in a lot of cases until very recently, a lot of women's sport didn't have that mainstream coverage. I mean, the BBC's commitment's ramped up a lot in recent years. You've seen interest from commercial broadcasters, but there's not really that wider ecosystem. So they've gone and created their own things on YouTube and Instagram. Is that something you look at in terms of when you bring in talent or looking to augment your coverage? People have created that following, perhaps done something different that maybe the BBC wouldn't have done internally.
Yeah, I mean, I think like for us, nothing's off the table. So, you know, when we're looking, obviously at the moment, we're thinking about how we're going to cover the Euros next year. We work with influencers and creators in the past as well. Obviously, more for bespoke content that has gone on social media platforms. But you know, you also want to bring it so then they are involved. So that might be something that goes out on Football Focus, for example. So it's just like trying to bring them into our ecosystem. But definitely, you know, if they have that following in a certain space as well, you want to be able to utilise that.
I'm not going to get to comment on specific rights deals that haven't been done, but women's sport has traditionally been undervalued. The sums we're talking about are either very low or negligible when we compare to the comparable men's properties, but they still attract audiences. And especially if you put an event on BBC Two on a Sunday afternoon when there's not much competition on free-to-air TV, it's going to do really, really well because people want to watch sport. So beyond that, would it make sense for the BBC to prioritise these sports that it can get, particularly as men's rights become more and more expensive or, you know, out of reach? It just makes good sense to go for these rights.
It does, yeah. I mean, obviously we do have budgets, and you know, and obviously we know that a big driver for us is men's football, so we still want to be in that space where we can, but we know we're not going to be able to afford to put on Premier League matches as such, which is why, you know, things like Match of the Day are so important to us, because people still want to watch, or they watch it again on the Sunday, or you know, watch it on iPlayer. They want to have that goals and that analysis. And so yeah, so we definitely want to do that. I think from a women's sport perspective, you know, it was a real strategic choice to really promote women's sport. You know, I get annoyed when we do lose rights, but I also understand that, again, you know, we have certain budgets that they'll only go to, and if we then get priced out, you know, there's not a lot we can do about it. I think increasingly you've probably seen that the BBC tends to go in partnership with other broadcasters. So obviously, you know, Women's Super League, this is the second deal we've done, and with Sky for the Women's Super League. I know with the Rugby Union, we do with the PWR, we do that with TNT. As I've said, you know, the Euros is with ITV, because I think it's great that obviously women's sport, because it is growing, those rights are becoming more and more expensive. But then ultimately that might mean that, you know, broadcasters like the BBC might then get priced out. I'd still feel it's massively important for sport to be free to air as best as it can be, and for it to be, as I said, you know, I've said before, for it to be visible but also discoverable, because if you don't know things are on, you're not going to watch it. But I just think the stage that a lot of women's sport is in at the moment, you know, I think if it went totally behind a paywall, I think that would really set it back.
Another trend we've seen is women's rights be unbundled from men's rights, and you know, I guess because they realised that the rights owner in some instances just wasn't giving it enough attention, or it wasn't the right fit, but it was thrown in as part of a deal. And obviously, I think the BBC's been a beneficiary of that process, because you can offer a bit, you know, a more bespoke approach, or give it more exposure. There wasn't going to be a question in there, but it's more a case of, you know, how has that helped you, you know, unbundling rights, because you've been able to go for women's competitions that would normally have just been thrown in with men's rights. You know, I guess things like the Women's FA Cup, or some, you know, things that were just seen as part of a wider picture rather than a property in their own right.
Yeah, I think it's sort of been a win-win for broadcasters, but then also for the women's sports, really. And also, I think also governing bodies and those who have the rights, they're probably seeing that there is more of a commercial aspect to it now, so they probably are quite happy to unbundle them as well. So I think really it's probably a win-win for everybody, but I'm not a writer, so I don't really know much more to say about it. I'm not really a rights person.
That's fair. But we just wanted to ask a couple questions about things that you will be showing in the next 12, 18 months. Start of WSL, which obviously you've been showing for a number of years now, rolled over the deal for this year. There's been a new contract. It's 5 years. That was, it was rolled over with the intention of securing that long-term deal. What does it mean for you to have that certainty for the next 5 years of being able to show WSL in partnership with Sky?
I mean, it's massive. It is massive. And I think not only for the BBC, I think it's really important for the game for it to remain on free-to-air. I mean, it's a slightly different contract. I don't know all the details to give you all now, but we have managed to negotiate better digital rights. So in the past, the match that you had live, you had free reign on what you put on social media, etc. Whereas actually now, and then any other match, you would have like a midnight holdback. That's come right down. So that's really good, because I think it's really important that we're allowed to put highlights out of other matches with a shorter holdback. So that's really important. But I mean, for it to be a 5-year deal, I think that's really big for the women's game. And it'll be interesting to see where we are in 5 years' time. But I know obviously a lot of money was spent on these rights, so just shows how it has evolved, but it still needs to do a lot more. But I just think it's really important that two big hitters were prepared to pay for it again.
And the 100, that's another deal's rolled over. I think for me personally, I've done my saying, I've not quite gelled with the men's edition, but the women's edition of the competition has definitely been a step change. It's been really good for promoting professional cricketers in England. I mean, how important was it to keep that on the BBC as well?
Yeah, I mean, the 100, as you say, I think there is obviously often saturation in sports, and there has been a lot of naysayers saying, oh gosh, do we need another cricket competition? We have tests, we have one-day cricket, we have T20, and then they brought the 100. So I can see what the naysayers are saying, but I think from a women's sport perspective, it has been a real revelation, actually. It's really helped build those female cricketers, and how much people know about them, because it, obviously had domestic players, but also brought in some of the big international players as well. So I think the 100 has been massively important for women's cricket, and that has really then helped, in other aspects. And, I was really proud that, the ICC, they have parity with prize money now, which is absolutely incredible for such a big sport. So it just sort of shows the power of that. So I'm just really pleased that there wasn't that, it could have been quite easy to have knocked that down, that competition, to think, oh, why are we doing it? But actually, as you say, from a female perspective, it's been really important. But I take your point, I think less so for the men's, although, people still watch the men's. It's not like they don't, but it hasn't been a bigger dial shifter, should we say, as it has for women's cricket. I've
been to several of the matches, and we've made sure we've got there for both games. We've gone to a double header. But my main issue is that Kent just aren't in it. That's probably for me. That's probably where I'm at with that. Yeah. There's two big major international competitions coming up next year. The first is the Rugby World Cup. Is that the first time the BBC has had the rights to it, or is it?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
With it being in England, it's going to be a major event, and then we've got Euro 2025 in Switzerland, and so England will be defending their title. How early is the planning going for that? Are you got everything in motion for those two big events?
I won't say everything in motion, but no. So actually, we did have a big BBC meeting last week, because, like, for us, we sort of said traditionally the even years that's when the big events were happening, because you'd have a men's football tournament or you would have an Olympics, and then the odd years were the ones where there wasn't as much. But actually, that's really important for women's sport. The odd years are really important for women's sport. So next year, as you say, there's the Euros, the Rugby World Cup, you've got World Athletics again. As you mentioned, you've got the 100 again, you've got Wimbledon. So there's lots of fantastic women's sport that we'll have next year. So we've already had one big meeting, and it's like, again, what can we do in that space? So, I mean, in 2019, we did this whole, so it's a joint marketing and editorial called Change the Game. And that was really important to link those two together. And off the back of that, I think in that summer, 45 million people watched women's sport across our platforms or consume the content. So it's like, how do we move that on? So I think for the next iteration, it was, we know our place, but we haven't quite come up with whatever our slogan is for the next one. But it is about, again, it's just an amazing showcase really for women's sport, and to show where it's come from and where it's going to. So watch out. It's going to be really, really, important year for women's sport next year.
And again, the Euros leading into the new WSL deal is also going to be, should be very beneficial. So, got one last question, and for someone who works closely with women's sport, is passionate about women's sport. When you build up a competition and then you lose the rights, or the rights go to another broadcaster, do you feel pride that it's got to a position where it has competing bids, that there is something that can commercialise the sport, and is there a bit of disappointment that they've left because you wanted to keep covering it? How do you feel feel about properties that go on something else, or even the Women's World Cup, which is now such a big event that ITV have finally decided they want to co-broadcast it with you?
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, I just want everything live on the BBC, but I know that's not going to happen. So no, I do. I do feel, a sense of real disappointment if we do miss out or we have to share, but I understand that. And really, but then I'm sort of like, you have to see that bigger picture. And for me, it's just making sure that, women's sport is available across the board, really. So you can't be too greedy and thinking you can have everything. But I wouldn't be, I remember we did lose the Euros in 2017 to Channel 4, so that was a real gut wrenching for me, but obviously we managed to get them back for 2022 when England won it. So that was great. So, I'm not daft. I know the way it's going as well. And as I said before, that women's sport is progressing so much that, it will come a time where BBC will not be able to afford certain things or be in a real dogfight for them. I mean, thankfully, I know obviously the government has protected certain events, and I think that's really important because you want, those biggest events to be available free to air. So I'm not saying they'll all be on the BBC, but I think it's really important that they are kept free to air, the bigger events.
I think we agree with that. There should be some parity on the list with with the men's competitions, especially as they grow in profile. Anna, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Right, Steve McCaskill, where are we?
We are in the main exhibition and networking area. Tom, you are literally behind a massive poster that says Huddles, and it's got a rugby scrum. So I don't know if we're going to be reenacting that after this pod, but it's where people have been meeting, striking deals, catching up with acquaintances, and generally just making the most of being on the ground here in Madrid.
Yeah, the hubbub of sports business is what you can hear in the background. I'll be frank, we've got a couple of beers in front of us, and that's because it's networking drinks, and that's absolutely acceptable. But as we sit over our cold cervezas, what, Steve McCaskill, have been your takeaways from the last couple of days here in Madrid?
There's been plenty of learnings, but I think one thing that has become apparent is that the media and broadcasting industry still really wants to learn a lot about AI. AI in broadcasting is one of the most developed use cases for AI. I think we're seeing that, things like video clipping, it's already apparent, but I think there's now a shift in focus to what they can do from a creative standpoint. And I think people just want to learn. There's not too many fast adopters yet. Everyone's trying to be fast followers, or at least keeping an eye on things. And I think the sessions that have involved AI have been pretty well attended. People just really wanting to learn how others are doing. And again, that's one of the benefits of coming to events like this. It's a good environment to just hear what others are doing and make, maybe it's almost like in public you don't want to be saying this like, oh, I don't really know what to do with AI, especially when you've got all these influencers and tech companies saying this is going to be the next big thing. If you don't, you're going to miss out. I think this is a relatively safe space on that front. And I've learned a few things about AI this week, which is extremely beneficial. So that's definitely my lead one. I think my other main one, and this is not exactly earth-shattering, but linear isn't dead, and PSBs, so public service broadcasters, are just as important as they've ever been. Maybe just their role is shifting a little bit. We, again, from what we heard, what we discussed earlier about Laurent Eric Lelay and France Télévisions and the Olympics. We also heard, about women's sport on the BBC. We had Channel 4 talking about social strategy. These are all public service, free-to-air broadcasters that are helping industry immensely in terms of getting that reach and helping to build out sports, create audiences that, is going to help everyone in the long run. And I know we're seeing a shift behind the paywall for a lot of properties, and we're seeing more of the crown jewels require a subscription. But I think it's just important that we acknowledge that PSBs play a role, and linear definitely isn't dead. The Olympics shown that there's huge audiences for live sport no matter what it is. And I think it's just something we should all bear in mind. We all want a healthy industry. We all want to make sure we've got good revenue streams and sports in a healthier place. But yeah, shouldn't discount the role of traditional broadcast.
Yeah, just picking up on that last point. The thing about linear TV, we've heard for a long time about its decline, right? We've heard that it's by 2030, no one's going to be watching linear TV anymore. That's frankly not true. It's going to be massively reduced, and we're already seeing that trend. That's happening year on year. But we've still got a large and aging population across Europe, similarly across North America, really like the sort of the major markets that are driving this. And they are also the people that have the money in the bank and pay for these services, right? And that's ultimately why it's going to be... there will be a transition, I think that's obvious, but it's not going to happen perhaps as quickly as was originally thought, because if it had, that might have already been the case, according to some projections.
I think we're going to see linear effectively become sort of smart playlists. For example, if you have Spotify or Apple Music, you have access to all the music in the world, but you still want either curated or algorithmically driven playlists, right? And if you go onto Netflix, sometimes you get that choice paralysis. You don't really know what to pick because there's so much content out there, whereas in the UK we have a channel called Dave, which basically shows repeats of classic comedies, and like sometimes I just stick that on because that choice has been made for me. And also the thing about sport is a communal experience, and it's great being able to watch whatever event you want. I love it. I follow a lot of sports. I will sometimes want to watch an event that isn't going to be a mainstream option, but at the same time I love watching events that I know lots of other people are watching. So I think we're always going to have a scheduled BBC, for example. It's just the distribution is going to be digital if it's not over the air. So yeah, linear may just go digital. It's still going to be a communal feed of content. It's not going away.
No, and I mean, sport only really exists in a linear format. It's not an on-demand product. It's a thing that happens between two very specific points in time. And actually, like for all of the challenges that kind of go along with that, that makes it almost the last piece of traditional broadcast that's like that. There's nothing else that demands you tune in at 3 p.m. on a Saturday, although actually in the UK you can't tune in at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. But you get my point. 12:30, 4:30 on a Sunday. Those are windows, and they exist for a reason, because that's the only time it happens. And no one wants to watch a 90-minute repeat. It just doesn't happen. It's probably what will prop up quite a large amount of linear TV, that and maybe Strictly Come Dancing.
I was going to say, I think I watch 3 things live: sport, news and Love Island. So that'll be my future linear mix.
And what a mix it is. Right, well, you've given a couple of takeaways. I'll give mine. When I first came to the event, it was called the OTT Summit, and obviously it's shifted to being SportsPro Madrid. But what is interesting is that we're starting to see the realisation of mainly like tier 1 rights holder driven OTT products, but also they are still very much enthralled and interested and investing in that space. So you only got to look at things like FIFA Plus, the NBA app, WNBA app. I was talking to Guillermo Epstein about this, and he was talking about UEFA's own OTT product and what they want to do with it, and some of the challenges that they have in marrying up the rights across their various different competitions and the ways in which those contracts work. But it still seems like it remains a goal for major tier 1 properties because, one, it allows them to control their data and know their fans better. But also, like, that's the sort of the cynical side of it. The other thing is it can be quite a good place for fans. Like, if you can give someone a place where they can store their tickets, they can engage with extra content, they can engage with other fans even. Like, that is something that people want.
I think we're at this event, and the backdrop of this is that a lot of things happening on social media in terms of what's happening with X and the shift to Blue Sky. And I feel like there is a greater desire to have control over the platform, not in a nefarious way. Just, if you're reliant on third parties for this content, you're also not maximising it in the way you want to because someone else is doing the business model. For example, if you go to Wimbledon or you go to the Open, you do have that app experience for people, going to the event and people watching at home. Tickets, really good example. Have the content, sure. And the point you just made about interacting with other fans, I do think a lot of sports have potential to be a platform for discussion as social media becomes more fragmented. I mean, for example, if you use the Athletic app, the Athletic is not a social network. Yeah, it's got live blogs and people are commenting on that. So that's an example of people wanting that space to have a proper conversation rather than just have abuse hurled at them or go off on tangents. And I think a lot of property, I'm not saying that the Open app is going to become the next big social network or anything like that. But I think for a short period of time, you can have that interaction and people will value it.
Yeah. My final question of this event, Steve, is: are you on Blue Sky yet?
I am on Blue Sky. I've been prioritising Blue Sky over X recently, and I'm glad to see a lot of the sports industry is starting to migrate over. Not everyone has, and I'm not sure if everyone will. But my initial experience with the app has been very positive. I think Threads doesn't really do what I want it to do. It feels like an extension of Instagram, and Blue Sky is promising. I think even 2 weeks ago I didn't think it had a chance of becoming as what it is, but there's a lot of momentum behind it.
And where can we find your blend of 5G and ESPN The Ocho on Blue Sky?
So McCaskill.bsky.social, I think that is the handle. The reason for that handle is that it's an open network, which means, for example, you could use your Blue Sky profile in the Open app or something like that. You can transfer your profile and your followers, so just direct around that. But it does mean that I'm having trouble remembering my handle. But if you search for @MickeyCaskill, you should find it.
There you go. That's where you're going to find that unique blend that you only get from a Steve McCaskill social feed. Right, I think that's enough for us at SportsPro Madrid. We'll be back with another episode very shortly. Also, watch out soon. We'll be coming with our famous and maybe infamous end-of-year quiz.
It's the highlights of my year, Tom, and I cannot wait.
Mine too.